The moment I saw my daughter-in-law smiling in Santorini with my retirement money hanging from her wrist, something inside me went completely quiet. I was sitting alone in my kitchen in Burlington, Vermont, with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold between my hands when the photo appeared on Facebook. Rachel had posted it only 4 minutes earlier. The sunlight behind her was golden, the ocean bright blue, the kind of expensive European vacation people my age usually only saw in travel magazines at the dentist's office. She wore oversized sunglasses, a white designer dress, and on her left wrist was a gold bracelet I recognized instantly, because 3 months earlier, I had sold my late husband's watch collection to help Ethan and Rachel through a rough patch. I remember staring at that bracelet while my heart slowly dropped into my stomach. Rachel had told me they were struggling to pay daycare bills and catch up on credit card debt. Ethan had sounded embarrassed on the phone. "Mom, we just need a little help until things stabilize." Those were his exact words. I believed him because he was my son. I believed him because after Harold died, Ethan became the only family I had left nearby. I believed him because mothers like me were raised to sacrifice first and ask questions later. My finger hovered over the screen as more photos loaded. Fancy dinners. A private boat tour. Rachel holding champagne beside a rooftop pool. In every picture, Ethan smiled like a man without a single worry in the world. I looked around my quiet little kitchen while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. The wallpaper near the window had started peeling sometime during the winter, but I kept putting off repairs because I wanted to help them. I had canceled a dental procedure last spring because Rachel said preschool costs were getting impossible. I even stopped driving up to see my sister in Maine to save on gas money. Yet there they were, somewhere in Greece, drinking cocktails that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I tried telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Rachel's parents paid for the trip. Maybe it was business-related. Maybe I was overreacting. But then my phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a fraud alert from my bank. International purchase, €1,842 and 67 cents approved. My chest tightened. I opened my banking app, so quickly my reading glasses nearly slipped off my face. Another charge appeared seconds later from a luxury boutique overseas. Then another from a 5-star hotel. I stared at the screen while my hands slowly began to tremble. Those charges were connected to the emergency card I had trusted Ethan with for family use only. A card linked directly to the retirement account Harold and I spent 42 years building together. Outside my kitchen window, snow still covered parts of the yard even though spring had already arrived in Vermont. The world looked cold and silent. Inside the phone, another notification appeared. Transaction approved. I kept staring at the screen, unable to breathe properly. Because for the very first time in my life, I realized my own son might have helped his wife turn me into their personal bank account. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did after a bad night. Vermont mornings in early April still carried winter in the air, and when I stepped into the kitchen, the hardwood floor felt cold beneath my socks. I stood at the coffee maker staring out the window while snow melted slowly along the edges of my backyard fence. Normally, that quiet view calmed me. That morning, it only made the silence feel heavier. I kept hearing Rachel's voice in my head. "You do not really need all that money sitting there, Margaret." She had said it last Thanksgiving while helping herself to another glass of wine in my dining room. At the time, she laughed after saying it, like it was harmless teasing. Everyone at the table smiled politely, including Ethan. I smiled too because I did not want tension during the holidays. But now, sitting alone at my kitchen table with my bank statements spread out in front of me, I realized Rachel had never been joking. I started looking through transactions one by one. At first, the charges months ago had been small enough to ignore. Grocery stores, gas stations, school supplies for my grandchildren. Then slowly, the amounts changed. Upscale restaurants in Boston, a luxury spa in New York, weekend hotel stays, designer clothing stores I had only heard about on television. I felt embarrassed with every page I turned because I remembered defending them to myself each time something felt off. Ethan works hard, I used to think. Rachel is under stress. Young families struggle nowadays. That was the lie I kept feeding myself because the truth hurt too much. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. My chest tightened immediately. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but I answered anyway. "Hey Mom," he said casually. I could hear airport noise behind him. "Everything okay?" I looked down at the bank statement in my hand. Are you in Greece? There was a pause long enough for me to notice. Then he laughed nervously. Rachel found a really good deal online. We figured the kids needed a break. The kids. My grandchildren were back in Vermont staying with Rachel's mother while their parents toured Europe using my retirement money. Ethan, I said quietly, did you use my emergency card for this trip? Another silence. This one colder than the first. Then Rachel's voice suddenly came onto the line in the background. Tell her we will pay her back, she snapped, loud enough for me to hear clearly. My stomach dropped. Not because of the money anymore, but because of how irritated she sounded that I had even noticed. Ethan lowered his voice. Mom, do not make this into something bigger than it is. I stared at the steam rising from my untouched coffee. Bigger than it is. I thought about Harold working double shifts for 30 years at the hardware distribution center outside Burlington. I thought about the vacations we never took because we prioritized savings. I thought about clipping coupons while raising Ethan, about hand-washing plastic bags to reuse them during hard years, about every sacrifice that built the retirement account they were draining like it belonged to them. You told me you needed help paying bills, I whispered. Ethan sighed heavily, already sounding annoyed. We do need help. Life is expensive now, Mom. You do not understand how hard things are for younger families. I almost laughed at that because my generation understood struggle better than most. We just carried it quietly. Before I could answer, Rachel spoke again, sharper this time. Margaret, honestly, what are you even saving it for? You barely travel. You sit in that house alone all day. The room went completely still around me. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to disappear. I looked at Harold's framed photograph beside the window, the same photo that had sat there since the day after his funeral. Rachel had no idea how many nights that quiet little house had held me together after he died. She had no idea what it cost to grow old alone. But somehow, in her mind, my loneliness made me financially available. Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly. We will talk when we get back, okay? Then the call ended. Just like that. No apology. No shame. No concern for whether I was hurt. I sat there for a very long time staring at the dark phone screen in my hand. Then another bank notification appeared at the top of the screen. Luxury boutique purchase approved. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened before I even looked at the screen. More charges kept appearing from overseas, each one feeling less like a transaction and more like a message. A message telling me exactly what Ethan and Rachel thought of me now. Not as family, not as a mother, just a quiet old woman whose savings account existed for their convenience. By Friday afternoon, the total had climbed past $11,000. I sat at my dining room table with a yellow legal pad beside me, writing down every purchase carefully in neat handwriting the same way Harold used to organize household bills. Luxury hotel, designer boutique, private tour company, fine dining restaurant. I kept hoping one charge would finally make sense, something connected to an emergency or the children, but every single purchase only confirmed the same ugly truth. They were enjoying themselves while I sat at home trying to decide whether I could postpone replacing my leaking water heater another year. Around 4 o'clock, my friend Diane stopped by, unexpectedly with a blueberry pie from the church bake sale. Diane had known me nearly 30 years, long enough to notice immediately when something was wrong. She stood in my kitchen watching me gather papers into a folder. Margaret, she said softly, what happened? I almost told her everything. The words sat right there at the edge of my throat. But embarrassment has a strange way of silencing people my age, especially mothers. We were taught to protect our children's image even when it hurt us. So instead, I forced a smile and told her I was just organizing retirement paperwork. Diane did not believe me, but she let it go. Before leaving, she touched my arm gently and said, "Do not carry something heavy alone too long." After she left, I stood by the kitchen sink staring out at the gray Vermont sky while those words echoed in my head. Because the truth was, I had been carrying Ethan for years. Not financially at first. Emotionally. Ever since Harold died, Ethan stopped calling just to talk. Every conversation became about a problem. The furnace needed repairs. Preschool tuition increased. Rachel's car payment was behind. Then little favors turned into expectations. Rachel especially had a way of making generosity sound mandatory. Family supports each other, she always said whenever money came up. But somehow support only flowed in one direction. That evening, I opened Facebook again against my better judgment. Rachel had uploaded another photo album from the trip. This time they were in Paris. Ethan stood smiling beside the Eiffel Tower holding shopping bags while Rachel posed in front of a jewelry store wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment back when Harold was alive. Hundreds of people had liked the photos. Comments poured in underneath. Living your best life. You too deserve this. Beautiful couple. I kept scrolling until I saw one comment from Rachel that made my chest ache. Finally learning to stop stressing about money and just enjoy life. I stared at those words for a long time. Stop stressing about money. It must be easy not to stress when somebody else spent 40 years saving it for you. Suddenly my phone rang again. Rachel this time. I hesitated before answering. Hi, Margaret, she said brightly, sounding completely different from the irritated woman I heard earlier that week. Quick question. Have you noticed any issues with the card? One of our purchases got flagged for verification. I closed my eyes slowly. Not once did she ask how I was doing. Not once did she apologize. Her concern was not my feelings. It was access. No, I answered carefully. I have not done anything yet. There was a brief pause. Then Rachel laughed lightly. Good. International systems can be so annoying sometimes. I could hear music and voices behind her, the sound of expensive happiness. Then she added casually, honestly, Margaret, you should travel more yourself. You cannot take retirement savings with you when you die. Something inside me shifted hearing that sentence. Until then, I had still been hoping this was carelessness, immaturity, poor judgment. But in that moment, I realized Rachel truly believed my money belonged to them eventually anyway. To her, my retirement was simply an inheritance she wanted early access to. After we hung up, I sat motionless in the quiet house while the evening light faded outside. Then I slowly reached for my bank folder again, this time no longer feeling confused. I was beginning to feel something far colder. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, the kind of cold Vermont rain that soaked slowly into the ground and made the entire town feel tired. I drove downtown just after 8 with my bank folder sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Every red light along Main Street gave me another chance to turn around and go home, but I kept driving anyway. By the time I parked outside the bank, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit in the car for nearly a full minute before getting out. I had banked at Green Mountain Community Credit Union for more than 30 years. The same branch manager had attended Harold's funeral. The same teller once gave my grandchildren lollipops when they were little. Walking through those doors felt strangely humiliating, like admitting I had failed at protecting my own life. Inside, everything smelled faintly like coffee and printer paper. A young teller greeted me politely, but when I asked to speak privately with someone about account activity, her smile shifted slightly. Not pity exactly. Concern. 10 minutes later, I sat across from a woman named Karen in a small office with frosted glass walls. She looked to be around 50, dressed neatly, calm in the way people become after years of handling difficult conversations. I handed her the folder without speaking much. Karen spent several quiet minutes reviewing the statements while I stared at a framed photograph of Lake Champlain hanging behind her desk. Finally, she looked up carefully and asked, Mrs. Collins, are all of these transactions authorized by you personally? Something about hearing the question out loud made my throat tighten instantly. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first. Karen's expression softened. You do not have to rush, she said gently. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. The card was meant for emergencies. My son had access. Karen nodded slowly and turned the monitor slightly so I could see the transaction history. There were far more charges than I realized. International purchases, luxury retailers, multiple hotel authorizations, airline upgrades, even recurring subscription services linked to my account that I had never noticed before. Karen clicked through page after page while my stomach sank deeper each minute. Mrs. Collins, she said carefully, lowering her voice. I want to ask this respectfully because we see situations like this more often than people realize. Has anyone been pressuring you financially? I stared at her in silence. Nobody had ever asked me that question before. Not my friends. Not my family. Certainly not myself. Pressuring. Exploiting. Those words sounded too harsh for something involving my own son. Yet suddenly, every uncomfortable memory started replaying clearly in my head. Rachel rolling her eyes whenever I hesitated about money. Ethan acting distant anytime I said no. The guilt. The manipulation. The the expectation that my retirement existed to solve their problems. Karen continued speaking softly. Sometimes older adults experience financial exploitation from people close to them, family members included. The room became painfully quiet after she said that. Financial exploitation. Hearing it described so plainly made my chest ache in a completely different way. Until then, I had still been framing everything as misunderstanding or selfishness. But exploitation sounded intentional, cold, calculated. Karen showed me how many devices had accessed my online banking over the past year. Several logins came from locations that were not mine. Some happened after midnight while I was asleep. Others matched cities Rachel had visited during girls' weekends she once claimed were budget trips. I felt heat rise into my face from embarrassment. How had I missed all this? Karen must have sensed what I was thinking because she leaned forward slightly and said something I will never forget. Trusting your family does not make you foolish, Mrs. Collins. It makes you normal. I looked down at my wedding ring and suddenly felt exhausted clear through my bones. Karen explained the options slowly. Freeze the card. Change online access. Open a separate protected account. File fraud reports if necessary. Every sentence sounded final, like bricks quietly building a wall between me and my own child. Before leaving, Karen printed copies of every transaction from the past 18 months and slipped them neatly into a folder. As I stood up to leave, she asked one last question. Would you like us to place a temporary hold on the account today? I hesitated only a second before answering. Not yet. Karen nodded, but her eyes told me she already understood something I was only beginning to accept myself. I walked back outside into the cold rain, clutching the folder against my chest, and halfway to my car, my phone suddenly buzzed again. Another charge from Paris had just gone through. That night, I sat alone in my living room with every lamp turned off except the small one beside Harold's old recliner. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the clock above the fireplace ticked louder than usual in the silence. The folder from the bank rested on my lap, thick now with printed transactions and account histories. I must have read through those pages 20 times already, but each time I noticed something new. Another hotel charge, another luxury purchase, another reminder that my kindness had slowly become their lifestyle. I kept thinking about what Karen at the bank said. Financial exploitation. The phrase no longer sounded dramatic to me. It sounded accurate. Around 10 o'clock, my phone lit up with a text from Ethan. Hey Mom, we are flying back tomorrow. Let us talk this weekend. No apology. No explanation. Just a casual message like none of this mattered. A few seconds later, another message appeared from Rachel. Please do not overreact before hearing our side. I stared at those words for a long moment. Overreact. It amazed me how quickly people accused older women of being emotional the second we stopped quietly tolerating disrespect. I set the phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in days, I stopped crying. The tears simply disappeared. In their place came something else. Something calmer. Clearer. I suddenly realized I had spent my entire life trying to avoid conflict, especially inside my family. Even after Harold died, I kept peace at my own expense because I was terrified of losing the little family I had left. But somewhere along the way, protecting the relationship became more important than protecting myself. And Ethan and Rachel had learned exactly how far they could push that weakness. I looked around the house slowly. The Afghan blanket folded over the couch. Harold's reading glasses still sitting on the bookshelf exactly where he left them years ago. The faded family photographs lining the hallway wall. This house held my entire adult life inside it. Every sacrifice, every overtime shift Harold worked, every Christmas morning, every difficult year we survived together. And suddenly the thought of losing financial control over everything we built made me feel physically ill. Just after midnight, I walked into my small home office and turned on the computer. My hands no longer trembled. I logged into my banking accounts one by one and began changing passwords carefully. New password. Two-step. Verification. Updated security questions. Removed linked devices I did not recognize. Then I transferred a large portion of my retirement savings into a brand new protected account Karen helped establish earlier that day. The process took nearly an hour. When I finally clicked confirm on the final transfer, I sat back quietly and stared at the screen. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. But I was not done. The emergency card Ethan carried still had access to the old account. I picked up my phone and called the 24-hour customer service number printed on the back of my debit card. A polite young man answered after several minutes. "Thank you for calling Green Mountain Community Credit Union. How may I assist you tonight?" I took a slow breath before speaking. "I need to freeze a card immediately." The representative verified my information while I stared out the dark window above my desk. Somewhere across the ocean, Ethan and Rachel were probably sleeping peacefully in expensive hotel sheets, completely unaware that the account they depended on was quietly disappearing beneath them. "The card has now been suspended," the representative informed me. "No additional transactions will be approved." Suspended. Such a simple word for something that felt enormous. After the call ended, I remained sitting there in silence. Part of me expected guilt to hit immediately. Shame. Panic. Instead, I only felt tired. Deeply tired. But underneath that exhaustion was something unfamiliar growing slowly stronger. Relief. The next morning, I woke early and made myself scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast, the first real meal I had eaten in days. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows while the coffee brewed. Outside, the snow in my yard had almost completely melted. Around 9:30, my cell phone suddenly began vibrating across the counter. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. Then again, and again. By the fourth call, I already knew exactly what had happened somewhere very far away from Vermont. The seventh call came while I was rinsing my coffee cup in the kitchen sink. Rachel again. Her name flashed across the screen so aggressively it almost felt angry. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel before finally answering. "Margaret, thank God," Rachel blurted out immediately. Her voice sounded sharp and breathless. "Something is wrong with the card." I leaned lightly against the counter and looked out the window at the wet backyard grass glistening under the morning sun. "I know," I answered calmly. Silence hit the line for half a second. Then Rachel lowered her voice. "Did you freeze it?" There it was. No pretending anymore. No fake sweetness. Just panic. I could almost picture her standing somewhere expensive, holding shopping bags while strangers waited behind her. "Yes," I said quietly. I heard muffled voices in the background, followed by Ethan speaking somewhere nearby. Rachel covered the phone briefly, then came back sounding irritated. "Margaret, you cannot do something like this while we are overseas." I almost smiled hearing that sentence because apparently they believed international travel entitled them to uninterrupted access to my retirement account. "Actually," I replied softly, "I can." Another silence. This one heavier. Then Ethan finally got on the phone. "Mom, what is going on?" His voice carried that familiar frustrated tone adult children use when they think their aging parents are becoming inconvenient. I walked slowly into the living room and sat beside the window with the phone pressed calmly against my ear. "What is going on?" I repeated. "Is that my retirement savings are disappearing while you and your wife vacation through Europe." Ethan exhaled loudly. "We already said we were going to pay you back." "With what money?" I asked before he could continue. That stopped him cold. Because we all knew the answer. There was no repayment plan. No timeline. No intention of stopping. There was only my account and their assumption that I would continue tolerating it quietly. Ethan's voice hardened slightly. "Mom, you are making this way bigger than it needs to be." I closed my eyes for a moment, suddenly exhausted by how predictable they both sounded. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Deny. Minimize. Redirect blame onto me. "Ethan," I said carefully, "do you know how much you have charged to my accounts over the last 18 months? He hesitated. "I do not know exactly." "I do," I answered. The room became completely silent except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. Then Rachel grabbed the phone back. "This is unbelievable," she snapped. "After everything we do to include you in our lives, you embarrass us in the middle of a trip over money." "Include me." The words hit harder than I expected. As if occasional invitations to birthday dinners somehow justified draining the savings Harold and I built over decades. I looked around my quiet living room again, at the framed family photos lining the mantel. Ethan at age 10 holding his first baseball glove. Ethan graduating high school. Ethan dancing with me at his wedding while Rachel smiled nearby in white satin. I wondered when exactly my role changed from mother to financial resource. "Rachel," I said softly, "you told me last month you could barely afford daycare." "Because daycare is expensive," she shot back immediately. "Life is expensive now. You have no idea what younger families deal with." I listened quietly while she continued complaining about inflation, housing costs, travel stress, and how difficult it was balancing work and parenting. Not once during that entire speech did she acknowledge what they had done to me. Not once did she ask whether I was frightened about my own future. Because somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as a person with needs at all. I was simply the older woman with the paid-off house and retirement account. Eventually, Ethan spoke again, quieter this time. "Mom, we are stranded here without access to funds." Stranded. They were staying in luxury hotels in Paris, not trapped in the wilderness. Yet somehow he managed to sound like the victim. I leaned back slowly in my chair and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. "No, Ethan," I said gently. "You are inconvenienced. There is a difference." Neither of them answered. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated the backyard in soft gold. For the first time in weeks, I noticed how peaceful my house actually sounded without the constant pressure of trying to rescue people who never appreciated it. Then Rachel spoke one final time, her voice colder now. "If you keep treating us like criminals, do not expect this relationship to recover." I held the phone quietly against my ear for several seconds before answering. "Rachel," I said softly, "relationships are supposed to be built on love, not access." Then I ended the call. 3 days later, Ethan and Rachel returned to Vermont. I knew because Rachel immediately posted a photograph of their luggage stacked inside the Burlington Airport terminal with the caption, "Home Sweet Home." I stared at the picture for a moment before setting my phone aside. Not one message asking to meet. Not one apology. Just another performance for social media, pretending everything in their lives remained polished and perfect. That Sunday afternoon, my sister Linda hosted her annual family lunch at her farmhouse outside Montpelier. Normally, I love those gatherings. Homemade casseroles lined across the kitchen counters, grandchildren running through the yard, cousins catching up over coffee while old country music played softly in the background. But as I drove there that morning, I felt an uncomfortable heaviness sitting in my chest. I almost stayed home. Something told me Rachel would not let the situation rest quietly. The moment I walked into Linda's house, I felt the tension immediately. Conversations softened for half a second. A few relatives glanced toward me, then quickly away. Rachel stood near the dining room holding a glass of iced tea, smiling brightly like nothing had happened. Ethan lingered beside her looking exhausted. "Margaret," Rachel called cheerfully the second she saw me. Her voice sounded overly sweet, the way people sound when they know an audience is watching. She walked over and hugged me lightly before I could react. "I am so glad you came." I noticed several family members subtly observing us from across the room. Rachel wanted witnesses. I understood that immediately. "Hello, Rachel," I answered calmly. Ethan kissed my cheek awkwardly, but could not quite meet my eyes. We all moved into the dining room a few minutes later while Linda carried out trays of baked chicken and mashed potatoes. I sat quietly near the end of the table listening to everyone talk about weather, gardening, school schedules, and summer vacation plans. Rachel dominated nearly every conversation, laughing loudly while describing Europe in dramatic detail. "Paris was absolutely magical," she announced proudly. "Honestly, people need to stop waiting until they are old to enjoy life." Several relatives nodded politely. Then Rachel glanced toward me and smiled. "Right, Margaret?" The room went still for just a second too long. I understood exactly what she was doing. She wanted me to react emotionally in front of everyone so she could paint herself as patient and reasonable. But something inside me had changed during the past week. I no longer felt desperate to defend myself. I simply felt awake. "I think people should enjoy the life they can actually afford," I answered quietly before taking a sip of iced tea. The silence afterwards stretched across the table like a crack in glass. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Rachel's smile tightened almost invisibly. Then she laughed lightly. "Well, not everyone wants to spend retirement sitting alone clipping coupons." A few nervous chuckles slipped around the table. My face grew warm instantly, not from shame this time, but from clarity. Rachel was trying to humiliate me publicly because humiliation had always worked before. Older women are expected to stay agreeable, especially inside families. We are expected to absorb disrespect quietly, so gatherings remain comfortable for everyone else. Linda finally cleared her throat softly and changed the subject, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. After lunch, while everyone moved into the living room for dessert, I stepped outside onto the back porch alone. The April air smelled like wet grass and melting snow. I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself and looked out across Linda's pasture while distant wind moved through the trees. A minute later, Ethan followed me outside. "Mom," he said quietly behind me. "Can we please stop doing this?" I turned slowly toward him. He looked tired, older somehow, but not guilty. Mostly inconvenienced. "Doing what?" I asked calmly. Ethan rubbed his forehead, making everything uncomfortable. I stared at my son for several long seconds. Somewhere deep down, I think he truly believed this conflict existed because I refused to stay silent. Not because he and his wife had drained my retirement account. "Ethan," I said softly, "you are worried about discomfort. I am worried about survival." He looked away immediately. That alone told me everything. Because a son who still understood his mother would have looked directly at her in that moment. Before either of us could say anything else, Rachel suddenly opened the back door behind him. "There you are," she said sharply. Then she looked directly at me with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "I think we all need to remember family is more important than money." I held her gaze calmly while the cold spring wind moved across the porch between us. Then I answered with the quietest voice I had used yet. Family should have remembered that before spending mine. The week after Linda's family lunch, something inside me became very organized. Not angry, not emotional, organized. Every morning, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and paperwork spread neatly across the surface while soft classical music played from the old radio near the window. For years, I had spent my energy reacting to problems Ethan and Rachel created. Now, for the first time, I started preparing instead. Tuesday morning, I met with an attorney named Daniel Mercer in downtown Burlington. His office overlooked Church Street, and shelves full of leather-bound legal books lined the walls behind his desk. He listened quietly while I explained everything from the emergency card to the overseas charges to the pressure and manipulation that had built slowly over time. Unlike me, he did not sound shocked by any of it. "Unfortunately," he said carefully, "financial boundary issues inside families happen more often than people admit." Boundary issues. Such polite words for betrayal. Daniel reviewed my documents for nearly an hour, occasionally highlighting transactions with a yellow marker while I sat silently across from him. Finally, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Collins, right now your priority needs to be protecting yourself long-term." Nobody had framed it that way before. Protecting yourself. Mothers from my generation were taught to protect everyone else first. Daniel explained several options calmly. Update the will. Remove all financial access. Establish a trust. Change beneficiaries on retirement accounts. Protect property ownership. Every sentence felt strangely empowering instead of frightening. For years, I avoided making firm legal decisions because I worried Ethan would think I did not trust him. Now I understood something painful but important. Trust without boundaries is not kindness. It is permission. By the end of the meeting, I signed paperwork beginning the process of restructuring nearly everything. Not out of revenge, out of survival. As I left Daniel's office, light snow began drifting softly through the Vermont air, even though spring had technically arrived weeks earlier. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and suddenly realized I felt lighter than I had in months. That evening, Ethan appeared at my front door unexpectedly. I opened it to find him standing there alone with both hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. He looked exhausted. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside without answering. Ethan sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee, mostly because silence felt easier with something to do. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then finally he sighed heavily. "Rachel is really upset." I almost laughed hearing those words because apparently Rachel's emotions still arrived first in every conversation. "I imagine she is," I answered calmly while placing his coffee mug in front of him. Ethan rubbed his face tiredly. "Mom, things got out of hand. We know that." I sat across from him, quietly waiting for more. An apology. Accountability. Something meaningful. Instead, he continued carefully. "But freezing everything without warning created a huge mess for us." Us. Again. Always them. Their inconvenience. Their stress. Their embarrassment. Never once had Ethan asked how frightened I felt discovering my retirement savings disappearing. "Do you know what created a huge mess for me?" I asked softly. He looked down immediately. That answer alone told me he understood more than he admitted. Ethan stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking again. Rachel thinks you hate her now. The sadness in his voice almost pulled me backward into old habits. Almost. But then I remembered every statement in my folder. Every manipulative comment. Every moment they dismissed my fear like it was an inconvenience. No, I answered carefully. I think Rachel stopped seeing me as a human being a long time ago. Ethan flinched slightly hearing that. Outside, wind rattled lightly against the kitchen windows while snowflakes drifted beneath the porch light. She said you are changing, he muttered quietly. I held his gaze steadily across the table. No, Ethan, I said softly. I finally stopped ignoring what was happening. He looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him before. Not because of age, because reality had finally entered the room between us. Before leaving, Ethan stood awkwardly near the front door while pulling on his jacket. So what happens now, he asked. I thought carefully before answering. Then I looked directly at my son and spoke with complete honesty for the first time in years. Now, I said quietly, I make sure I never depend on people who are comfortable hurting me. Ethan stared at me silently for several seconds. Then without another word, he walked out into the cold Vermont night while I locked the door gently behind him. By early summer, the tension between me and Ethan settled into something quieter but far more honest. We still spoke occasionally, usually about the grandchildren or practical things like birthdays and school events, but the easy closeness we once had never fully returned. Some losses do not happen all at once. They happen slowly, conversation by conversation, until one day you realize the relationship standing in front of you no longer resembles the one you spent years protecting. Rachel barely contacted me anymore unless absolutely necessary. At first, that silence hurt. Then eventually, it felt peaceful. One warm June morning, I drove out to Lake Champlain with a folding chair and a paperback novel tucked into my tote bag. The sky stretched bright blue across the water while sailboats drifted quietly in the distance. I sat there for hours listening to the gentle sound of waves against the rocks and realized something surprising. For the first time since Harold died, I was not living in constant emotional tension. I was no longer waiting for the next phone call asking for money, the next guilt-filled conversation, or the next subtle insult disguised as humor. The pressure that had surrounded my life for years had finally lifted. A few weeks later, Daniel finalized the updates to my estate paperwork. The trust was complete. My accounts were secure. Access permissions were permanently changed. I also made one additional decision that surprised even me. A significant portion of my estate would eventually go to the Burlington Public Library Foundation and a local scholarship program for women returning to school later in life. Harold always believed education changed people's futures. Somehow it felt right honoring him that way instead of leaving everything vulnerable to entitlement and resentment. When Ethan learned about the changes, he called me late one evening sounding shaken. Mom, he said carefully, you really changed everything? I stood in my kitchen watering the small basil plant growing beside the window while listening to his voice. Yes, I answered calmly. He was quiet for several seconds before asking the question I think had been haunting him for weeks. So what happens to us now? I looked around the kitchen slowly. The same kitchen where I once cried over bank statements now felt warm and safe again. That depends on whether you know how to love me without needing something from me, I said softly. Ethan did not answer immediately. And honestly, neither of us truly knew the answer yet. Later that summer, I downsized from the large family house into a smaller cottage near the outskirts of Burlington. The decision shocked several relatives. Rachel apparently told people I was being dramatic, but the truth was much simpler. I no longer wanted to spend my life maintaining rooms built for people who only visited when they needed something. My new home was smaller, brighter, and peaceful in a way the old house had not been for years. I planted lavender near the front porch. I joined a local book club. I even started taking watercolor classes every Thursday afternoon at the community center downtown. One evening after class, I stopped for coffee and found myself laughing with strangers about terrible paintings and retirement hobbies. Driving home afterward with the windows down and warm Vermont air moving through the car, I suddenly realized I felt something I had not felt in years. Lightness. Not because my family situation magically healed. It had not. But because I finally understood that protecting myself did not make me selfish. It made me sane. Near the end of August, Ethan brought the grandchildren to visit my cottage without Rachel for the first time in months. The children ran through the backyard, chasing fireflies while Ethan stood awkwardly beside the porch railing watching them. "They like it here," he said quietly. "So do I answered. He nodded slowly. Then after a long silence, he finally whispered something I had waited months to hear. "I should have protected you better." The evening air grew still around us. I looked at my son standing there beneath the soft porch light and realized he genuinely meant it. Not because he lost access to money, because for the first time, he understood what it cost me emotionally to realize my own family had stopped seeing me clearly. I touched his arm gently and smiled sadly. "I know," I said. Across the yard, my grandchildren laughed loudly while fireflies blinked softly through the dark summer grass. And standing there in the quiet Vermont evening, I understood something that took me nearly 70 years to learn. Some women spend their whole lives believing love means endless sacrifice. But real love does not ask a person to disappear in order to keep the peace.